Welcome to our week on the geographies of race and ethnicity, so-called the melting pot or the tapestry. We can begin to wonder. So what's the difference anyway between these terms we sometimes hear used interchangeably? Studies have demonstrated that there is a far more genetic variable within so-called racial groups than between them, which has led most scholars to believe that human beings are, genetically speaking, members of only one race, the Homo sapiens sapiens. So this is quite an interesting point to bring out into the world and for us to learn more about. It's how we can begin to see that race is really a social construct, and the more important factor here is racism. That is the belief that human capabilities are determined by racial classification and that some races are superior to others. So this is really where the critical social science view begins to stem from and begin to critique society and injustice. However, ethnic group is a much more shared understanding throughout social science and beyond, related to a group of people who share a common ancestry or in cultural tradition, often living as a minority group in the larger society. So along common characteristics of ethnicity include a strong feeling of group identity. Also, a membership in an ethnic group is largely involuntary. Many times people are born into it. In some cases, outsiders can join an ethnic group by marriage or adoption. And often the boundaries of ethnicity are fuzzy and shift over time, fuzzy meaning unclear. And so we begin to see here how ethnicity is just the adjective or the quality of being ethnic, of an ethnic group. Other words in the English language ends with icity to describe a certain quality. Here we see a great map of ethnic minorities in China. China has 55 official ethnic minority groups called Ch.5 Minzu, and the Han Chinese make up the 56th minority, or not minority, but 56th ethnic group in China, comprising about 92% of the population. So that's about 1 out of 5 of Earth's inhabitants are Han Chinese, making it by far the world's largest ethnic group. So we begin to see this certain regional concentrations on this map, and we can wonder perhaps why these minority populations are concentrated sparsely in sparsely populated peripheries of the country. Perhaps as we go on, we'll begin to understand that more, but some prominent groups to point out are the Tibetans in the west, and above them to the north, the northwest corner, the Uyghur people. In the southwest corner in the deep blue are Thai peoples, marked on the map as Hani, but in the valleys there'd be the Thai people below them in terms of elevation. So immigrant and indigenous groups, many ethnic groups originated when they migrated from their native lands and settled in a new country. And then it's interesting for us to understand how in their old home, they often belonged to the host culture and were not ethnic. But then when they were transplanted by relocation, diffusion, to a foreign land, they became a minority and ethnic. So a classic example being the migrations of Irish coming to New York City and the east coast of the US in the mid 19th century after the potato famine, which was largely created by English oppression and colonization of Ireland, resulting in their starvation, not just because of the potato blight. But I digress, the important point being the relocation diffusion of the Irish to the US. They then became a minority and an ethnic group within the US. Indigenous ethnic groups that continue to live in their ancient homelands become ethnic when they are absorbed into larger political states. So what has happened with the Native American nations and tribes throughout the U.S. Speaks to this point, as they are encapsulated by the larger U.S. predominantly WASP, the acronym WASP for the White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So looking at these themes and concepts through the lens of our first theme of region, you begin to look at ethnic homelands, which are sizable areas inhabited by an ethnic minority that exhibits a strong sense of attachment to the region, oftentimes with some measure of political and social control. And because of their size, age of inhabitants, and geographical segregation, they tend to reinforce ethnic identities. So you can begin to see here selected ethnic homelands in North America, past and present, and concentrations of rural ethnic islands, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. But the color scheme ranging from viable ethnic homeland, light purple, such as the French Canadian in the St. Lawrence Valley of the northeastern part of the continent, all the way over to concentrations of ethnic homelands on the orangish color scheme throughout the prairies and plains. You have Dutch, German, Scandinavian ethnic islands scattered throughout there. So ethnic islands are small ethnic areas in rural countrysides, sometimes called folk islands. They occupy a very small area and serve as a home to several hundred or several thousand people at most. They don't exert a powerful influence because of their size and isolation compared to ethnic homelands. And even a step smaller in scale from there, we have ethnic neighborhoods, voluntary community where people of like origin reside by choice. It could be nearby kin, or other benefits might include common use of language other than the majority culture, stores and services tailored to a certain group's taste. And to see some of these, such as Chinatown in San Francisco. Another example here in Miami Beach, Florida, is home to a large community of Orthodox Jews, constitute a visible ethnic presence in the neighborhood. There's been shifts in the ethnic mosaics as well, and the U.S. immigration laws shifted in '65 from quota system, now giving preference to certain categories of migrants. Asian and Latin America rather than Europe are now the principal source of immigrants to North America. And this map speaks to that with the Hispanic population by states. Puerto Rico, of course, being over 99%, but much of the U.S. Southwest, including California and Nevada, being from 21 to 47% Hispanic or Latino, or perhaps Latinx by population. The recent shift in ethnic mosaics suggests that the continued concentration established ports of entry, most in the coastal areas. But as a nation, we are becoming more diverse, more colorful mosaic. But we are nowhere near the melting pot we sometimes portray ourselves to be. The U.S. is home to more foreign-born people, 40 million as of 2010, than any other country. These individuals represent about 13% of the country's population, so this is very significant. Mobility theme, migration ethnicity, very, very important theme to look at within ethnicity. Much of the ethnic pattern in many parts of the world is a result of migration. All humans descending from a group of Africans migrating out of Africa about 60,000 years ago. Voluntary migrations have produced much of the ethnic diversity in the US and Canada. Involuntary migration of political and economic refugees continues to be a very strong force, becoming ever more so in North America. We can look at involuntary migration within Syria right now. It's based by conflict, map showing civil war related displacement, more than 1.5 million Syrians. That was as of March 2012. Some have left Syria and refugees in neighboring countries. And these are, very significant forces playing out that speaks to involuntary migration or forced migration. Can be similar, related to internally displaced persons. Persons are groups that have been forced to flee their homes due to conflicts. And then there's refugees. Persons are people that have been forced to flee due to conflict, natural disaster, or persecution. So through the theme of globalization, we begin to look at the long view of race and ethnicity. Long-standing cohesion shared by language, religion, ethnicity provides group members with the perception of a common history and shared destiny. These become deeply embedded cultural themes and social fabric. And unfortunately, occupying a minority religious, linguistic, or ethnic position can expose a group to persecution. In terms of race, European colonization, Europe's colonization of vast territories was predicated on drawing up sharp distinctions between colonizers and the colonized, often depicted in racial terms. So using this social construction to manipulate, oppress, and colonize. European colonialism frequently drew on existing ethnic and racial cleavages or separations within colonized societies. So for example, the Tutsis and the Hutus in Rwanda of the 1990s brings up the point of how this can lead to genocide, a systematic killing of racial, ethnic, religious, or linguistic group. The indigenous and minority identities in the face of globalization is very important to look at in terms of ethnicity in today's world. Exposure to US-based cultural practices is thought to encourage people to shed their distinctive ways in favor of adopting a homogeneous, modern Western culture. It's often the critique in many areas around the world, disdain, dislike, or even more severe of Western, in particular US cultures, because of Hollywood, music media, news media's ability to run roughshod and ram that cultural notion down into other cultures. So late in the 20th century, however, ethnic resurgence became evident in many countries around the world, and many ethnic groups and their geographical territories have become bulwarks of resistance to globalization. Interesting example here, Japanese Brazilians. These girls who are of Japanese ancestry attend a traditional Japanese Day of the Dead ceremony in Registro, Brazil. It's home to one of the oldest Japanese Brazilian communities. Nature culture theme, we can begin to see how the habitat and preservation of cultural difference. These are tied into themes that certain habitats may act to shelter and protect ethnically distinct populations. Mountainous regions such as the Caucasus can provide lots of shelter. Also islands, coastal islands of South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida of the Gula culture. Here we see the Caucasus Mountains again between the Black and Caspian Seas in Western Asia. Very mountainous terrain. Here you can see over 20 different ethnic groups. This is what's known as a shatter belt, when there's a very mountainous terrain with highly diverse topography that creates separations that allow for the preservation of ethnicity, language as well. And then there's the aspect we need to consider of environmental racism within the nature culture theme. Targeting of areas where there's ethnic or racial minorities, immigrants, or poor, with respect to environmental contamination or failure to enforce environmental regulations. In the US, this is often the case with Hispanics, Native Americans, blacks, and poor of all races are more likely than wealthier whites to reside in places where toxic wastes are dumped, or there's weaker environmental legislation. So here we have the San Francisco Bay Area, and we can see the toxic release inventory related to counties of percent people of color. There's a correlation that we see around the bay there. Speaks to environmental racism very strongly. Great tools of cartography and geography of being able to demonstrate social injustice. Lastly, through cultural landscape, you can look at the concept of an ethnic flag, a readily visible marker of ethnicity on the landscape. I'm just going to skip, we can come back to those descriptions there, but I'm going to skip to the photo of it here, an ethnic flag and a cultural landscape. This is a maize granary called a Quetzalcoatl. It's a unique indigenous population of the, I can't pronounce it correctly, state in Mexico. The structure holds shelled maize or corn. So let's continue these questions below.